both. Welcome to this LinkedIn live session. And today's topic is geospatial, the driving force behind changing the global utility landscape. So we're going to have a discussion, and I'm very pleased to welcome Prouty, who's going to join us. He's at IDC. He's their Group VP of Manufacturing Insights and Energy Insights. So he has a large team of consultants and analysts globally who are looking at both the manufacturing and energy market. So basically the format, and I'll introduce Kevin a little bit more in a minute. The format is that we're going to have a bit of a discussion. There is the opportunity for you to post questions in the chat window. So I'd certainly urge you to do that. And our moderator will make us aware of those questions. So we'll try and address those. Let me very briefly introduce Kevin, and then I'll pass the floor to him to say a few words. So Kevin spent 30 years in both the manufacturing and utility space. He's built and run water and power plants, managed power engineering staff, installed power control systems, and many other things. Been with IDC just over 5 years. He says, to quote, he's still an engineer. Well, we're going to have an interesting conversation because despite the fact I work with engineers, I'm not an engineer. So we'll have a nice discussion between an engineer and a liberal arts. So maybe Kevin, if I could pass over to you initially just to make some opening comments and set the context.
Sure. John, thank you. And thank you all for coming to listen. I very much appreciate being given this opportunity. We do a lot of work around technology in utilities and oil and gas as well. And one of the things we focus very heavily on GIS. It's a core component to how utilities manage their assets and manage their customers. But I think the transformation we're going to kind of focus on today is that transformation from GIS being kind of a specialty, being a specialist inside a utility organization, to being a truly accessible and dynamic data source for those utilities. So I think that's what we're going to end up focusing on as we carry on this discussion. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess I should probably also just very briefly introduce myself. So to give some context on why I'm here. So I used to sort of wear a couple of hats within Scient, but the relevance here is, and for those of you who don't know Scient, our business started with GIS and geospatial almost 30 years ago. And I'm very lucky to run our geospatial business globally. So, and we very much see, and I think this is one of the themes, we see geospatial, obviously, we've seen the evolution of geospatial from a direct market and the organizations such as national mapping agencies, the military, defense, and increasingly areas like agriculture, insurance, who use geospatial day in, day out, but increasingly this horizontal capability. And I think that's something that we'll touch on in this talk. So part of my focus and part of what I'm doing with my team is really saying how we can leverage the power of location, the power of geospatial across some of the industries that Scient work in. So for example, we have a very strong communications business, and obviously we have a big utility business that we'll talk today. So how can geospatial really add value and maybe move away from where, and I think, Kevin, we talked a little bit about this, and I think you'd agree, this idea of GIS being a silo and being really sort of kind of for experts and standalone to something where it's starting to transform the landscape within a utility. In terms of the sort of the flow and what we're going to talk about a little bit, I think the key thing we really want to say is how much geospatial, and I think geospatial data is undervalued and underused, and I guess we're seeing a transition from where, obviously, from a regulatory perspective, from a compliance perspective, having all that data in a GIS system has been an integral part of utility. It's not new. But I think what is changing, and maybe Kevin, you'd like to comment a little bit, is how now this geospatial data with other data sources is really becoming a feed and helping some of the transformational and digital aspects of a utility organization.
Yeah, I think it's. In some ways, it seems obvious on the surface that you would try to focus on a GIS type application. I think the key part here is it's not. And utilities recognize this, but I think we all kind of pass over it as we're thinking about geospatial, and that is that that gives you a dimension to how you manage your business. There's the asset side, how stuff's working in the field, and the customer side, and being able to get that location information and it's not just getting the information, but organizing and being able to use it with other applications as I talked about already as a data source for some more advanced analytics. As you start to see utilities and other types of organizations really start to focus on advanced analytics, eventually focusing on AI to run some of their business processes or support them. That locationing data is going to be incredibly important, and choosing a platform and an implementation for that data, you kind of got to start now. It's not going to be something that you can just stick in there and say, okay, it's running now. You're going to have to put it into your organization and grow it inside your organization.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think you had an interesting analogy with kind of like the role of weather in some of these utilities and how that's sort of changing. And maybe, I think that's a really good way of thinking how sort of the GIS data is expanding beyond maybe the expert users.
Yeah, I think weather is a great analogy to locationing, in that they are. I go back to some of the plants I've run, and we always had a weather specialist. Sometimes that was only their part-time job, but their job was to come in. I literally had a guy used to come in and have to write down the humidity that he had seen, on the forecast that morning, and so that we could track it in our plants. And GIS is the same way. There are specialists, there are people who focus on, that's all they do. And that siloed, I've told John this before. One of my favorite sayings is, every engineer is a data silo of one. And that's what happens with these specialists, weather and GIS and geospatial, is that they, not through any fault of their own, but they tend to silo all that data. And the transformation that's happening in GIS is that you're now being given, and part of it's through other transformational technologies like cloud and big data, but the truly transformational piece of this is that anyone inside a utility can now access that location information and start to use that location information to really add value to the tasks they have.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And we've seen that with a number of our customers where, I guess, almost the first stage is giving that single source of truth, building that complete data set, and then making it available across the organization. And clearly, technology has helped. And I think also kind of the mindset of the utilities as they think about serving that data and making it available. And there's some great applications, some great examples. One of the areas where we're doing a lot of work is on grid analytics, and I think the combination of using some of the inherent GIS data and connectivity data, and then mixing that with real-time operational data starts to give some real insights. I think particularly we talked a little bit about this, particularly at the sort of the retail side, at the distribution side, but I think it's also interesting to and maybe you want to comment a little bit about that. Again on the role of AI and machine learning and areas like that, and where that's sort of having most impact in the utility, from your opinion.
Yeah, I think I've seen this at one very large utility in the Southwest that we did some work with. They were building, and they actually piloted it, and it's still going, what I call it automatic truck roll. And that is basically, they built a small AI model, and probably 80% of the value of that model is geospatial information, in that they can start to detect feeders that are going to drop, or they're having issues. Maybe they have a new solar panel that just came online, and they're starting to have some frequency issues on that line, and they can start to predict and roll the truck without human intervention. And if they didn't have that geospatial information, it's not just that they had the information, the way they implemented geospatial or GIS is exactly like we're talking about now. They implement it so that it's across the entire organization, and they built a data structure, and the most important part, they built a data governance model of who has access to it, what you can do with that data, and that data is what feeds, like I said, about 80% of the value of that those automatic truck rolls through that AI model.
Yeah, I think really interesting. And one of the areas where I know we're doing a lot within the business, and we get quite excited about sort of solutions like mobile LiDAR, and again, how you can, and particularly in the current climate and with COVID and the pandemic, of how you can avoid the cost of people going out in the field, but also the related risks and operational management of having those truck rolls. So we're doing a lot of work and really excited about the opportunity of combining mobile imagery, mobile LiDAR into solutions that enable utilities really to manage their infrastructure, look at the condition of their assets without actually having to be out in the field. And again, it's never going to replace everything, but it's that 80-90% rule that enables the utility to be that much more efficient and focus their resources where they need it, which I think is absolutely key.
Yeah, and there's a short term and long term with locationing. There's the short term of knowing where trucks are, knowing where your employees are, and then there's the long term asset management, asset inspection piece. And I think one of the more interesting things I've seen, people bandy about the term digital twin a lot, but one of the more interesting, and that same Southwest Utility, by coincidence, is in the process of developing a model for their underground assets and lines, and they're looking at things like soil composition. They're looking at traffic patterns over those lines. They're looking at nearby buildings and the construction that's going on in those buildings. So they bring in all this up, but that, again, I'm going to point this out. It seems obvious, but they could not do this. They couldn't build this digital twin of their underground lines without GIS, and it's those type of what I would call transformational use cases that are enabled by GIS. And, if you think about the cost of maintaining those lines, the model they're trying to develop is right now they have to tear those lines up, dig up those lines periodically and inspect them. The model they're trying to build is one where they can probably cut the number of inspections by, 3/4, something like that. And again, all enabled by GIS.
Okay. And again, yeah, I think that very much builds on the theme and what we were talking about. And I think it's this sort of, in the past, GIS was a statement of record. It was seen as, it was a mapping tool. It was kind of like, well, yeah, we could print out some circuit diagrams. I think it's very much this, it's really a data repository, and it supports, it's a decision support tool.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you talk about that transition from kind of the, just a system of record. I attend a GIS conference. I've attended 5 years in a row now. And the first year I went, it was all cartographers there. It was all government, DOD, a lot of naval cartographers there. This is a conference that had probably 20,000 people. The last time I went, which was last year before the pandemic, and I would say the first time I went into a room with the utilities, and there were probably a dozen people there listening to a little presentation about utilities. The last time I went, that room was overflowing. There was probably a couple hundred people wanted to be in listening to that. And I think it to me reflects the transformation in how utilities view GIS.
Yeah, no, I think that's we'd absolutely agree, and I think we're seeing that trend. I mean, we would typically, I think, and I think it's reflecting on who we might typically engage with at a GIS. So, normally in the past we'd maybe talk to an asset manager or even a GIS manager, and the fact now that you would talk to the wider operations or the digital transformation team or a wider part of the business, even potentially, into the IT organization, the CIO, I think is a reflection of where GIS is moving from and where it rightly sits as a decision support tool.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think who you as science, who do you sell to? And I think that the transformation is reflected more than likely, like you said, who you're selling to. I also think there's another aspect to this. We deal with a lot. Almost every utility around the world, their biggest partner is a local municipality or a series of municipalities. And a lot of those municipalities have very large GIS organizations. GIS is a foundational part of how they manage the infrastructure base of the municipality itself. And one of the trends I've seen is utilities and municipalities not truly unifying their GIS systems, but at least trying to make them work together so that they're not duplicating effort. Their data semantics are at least similar enough. And especially when you get into things like smart lighting, where there's shared responsibility for smart lighting between a utility and a municipality, that has paid huge dividends to I know a couple of West Coast US cities that that has been a huge benefit for them.
Yeah, and I think that's I think we absolutely support that. And if you look at the sort of the smart infrastructure, clearly the data the utility has is very relevant to multiple organizations, and the more, again, it goes from being a proprietary standalone in-house system to more of an open data accessible for those bits of information that are important for other for other parts of the of a city, of a municipal organization. I think that's absolutely relevant. I'm just looking at there's one interesting question. I guess it sort of fits in absolutely with our topic in terms of what are your thoughts on kind of the GIS helping drive operational efficiency and improving that the end user customer experience? Because I guess sometimes I think for us, we still you're asking who we sell to. I mean, we will deal with the asset manager. We'll deal with vegetation management, do a lot of work in that area. We'll deal with the IT teams, but we don't tend to always get very close to the consumer. So how do you have any comments on that, and how you see the sort of the impact on the consumer experience?
Well, what's interesting, really, really interesting about this to me is I had a long conversation with a utility executive in the U.S. Northeast, and we were talking about GIS and the importance of it to them. And the one thing he found inside his organization was GIS became the unifying data structure between the operations part of the business and the customer part of the business. Because, as a utility, obviously, it's not just about assets. You need to look at where your demand's coming from. And he said, basically, they had settled on GIS. I always say when you're working in a large number of large systems in an organization, whether it's a utility, a refinery, or manufacturing, you kind of have to, all the systems I look at as cement, and some of them you have to let harden, and some of them are softer so you can move them around. This gentleman said basically their GIS system was their cement. That was a system that hardened, and everything else is going to work around it because they felt that it reflected their customers and their operations and how they connected together. I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great, and I think you probably have a system, a financial asset system, an SAP or whatever it might be, and the GIS, and then some sort of operational system, and those are the three pillars that I think I'd absolutely agree that underpin most utility organizations. So I guess one of the things we were recently participating at the ESRI event, the IMGIS event last week, and one of the things where we had a lot of interest was obviously around digital transformation and this sort of I guess I'd be interested to hear a little bit more from you about the sort of how far you feel utilities are down that road, and maybe compared to some of your manufacturing customers. Where are the obvious areas that maybe they could be doing more? And maybe I could also then share a few thoughts from our side.
Yeah, I think if I had to kind of build a maturity curve, I would say on the customer side, manufacturing companies, especially CPG and food and beverage companies and such, are probably well ahead of utilities because they do a ton of demographics work. Where utilities are well ahead is on the operational side. As much as manufacturing companies could use GIS, it's probably number 7 on a list of 10 things they're worried about. Whereas many utilities have started to build their operational structure on GIS, and their outage management systems are built on it. As soon as you start building your outage management system around something, that what you're building around becomes a cornerstone for the rest of what you're doing with your systems and operations in a utility.
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely concur with that. And I suppose what we're seeing, and there's still, it's back to this sort of single source of truth and making sure the gaps. And I think, again, we were talking before the session about, some of the still real world issues that exist in the data of, it might be in the system and it might be recorded, but actually in the real world, it's just not in the right place. And that becomes that sort of very practical challenge. And I think that's the other thing we're seeing, is this need for ever increasing accuracy. And I think one of the things that's handicapped, if I look back over the last sort of 25, 30 years, I think a lot of data was digitized and put in a GIS, but I don't think it was really done correctly. And I don't think it was really thought through. And I think what we're now seeing is a real demand for smart data, and I use smart with a small s. So, it's not necessarily the right word, but a proper connected data that really has some meaningful intelligence.
And I think it ties to this question that we see. This question right here. I mean, it's not just that GIS is impacting utility. The utility is impacting how GIS needs to be used. I mean, you look at the GIS companies out there, the independent ones, even the open source stuff, and they're changing how they manage their data. They're moving to the cloud. They're making sure that all their data is accessible. They're making sure that there are data management and data governance tools available. So I think it's not just that utilities are being changed by GIS. GIS is being changed by how utilities want to use them.
I think that's and absolutely when you start looking at the consumer side and the amount of data coming through from AMI, smart meter, and the challenges and the volumes become enormous. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's and I think it's also credit to a lot of the players in the market, the technology companies that again back to that statement of record and the core purpose. It's still the same systems that maybe were put in 20, 30 years ago that are doing a really good job for that purpose, but maybe in the wider context of cloud and access for other users, they're maybe not the right tools.
Yeah, it's when you mentioned data, because we just did a big study on data generation and data consumption. Utilities were part of this, and what we saw was data generation is going to triple for utilities, utility operations between now and 2025. But the interesting part is data consumption of that data is increasing by a factor of 5 to 6. So in other words, people are going to consume data at a faster rate than is being generated. And the ratio is about in 2025 3 to 1, so 2 to 1 for every 2 terabytes generated, you have a terabyte that is going to be consumed in 2025, something like that. I don't have the exact numbers, but the point is that I'll ask you a question, John, because I think you're on the ground with some of this stuff.
Sure.
How do utilities transform themselves to handle that data?
Yeah, it's good. It's a really good question. I think they're having to think really hard and look at it. And I think my opinion would be partly it's a mindset shift, because I guess historically they've been again it's back to a control mentality, it's a regulation mentality. It's the data sits internally, the data has to be managed and all kept and all data has to be kept and recorded. So there's that very much a sort of safety first. And I think actually to your point, a lot of the data they don't actually need to keep. That there's a small. It's getting the insights, isn't it? It's getting the value from probably a very small percentage of the data they have. And I think that's the challenge, and that's the change they're having to reflect on.
Yeah, and I think the to me the big transformation is I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but it's the cloud. Yeah. The cloud, whether it's a private cloud, public cloud, however it's managed, but the accessibility you get for data is just enormous. And I think that's something we always need to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'm just looking at an interesting question, and it's specifically around India, but I think also, again, both of us are sort of involved globally on different markets, and my experience more with North America and with Europe, yourself globally. Are you seeing kind of the what's happening in North America is way ahead of what's happening in Europe or Australia? Australia is a market that's very innovative, and they've always been very good at adopting. They were very early with things like smart metering, and they're very good at the
Australians are a little different anyway. So
sorry,
the Australians are a little different anyway. So it's hard to lump.
Do you see any sort of any particular markets where that driving force maybe is more prevalent,
Well, I think the Western European or the EU market is probably well ahead in application because of some of the regulatory issues that are driving them. So you have retail companies that are, and you see the same pattern over here where you have deregulated states. You tend to see GIS much more focused on the customer side. Where you start to see GIS pull ahead a little bit in North America is on the operations side. I see a lot more investment in GIS on the operations side in North American utilities, and I think Asia Pacific's kind of halfway in between. Let's set aside Australia. I think Australia is still very innovative. They are willing to take chances on technology to try to drive change in their utilities. So I would just set them aside as a completely different market.
Unique. Okay, good.
No offense.
No. I think I'm not Australian, so none taken.
Yeah, no offense to that.
I suppose for us, actually, it was a market that we've always been quite strong in, and my observation, having sort of dealt with them, is that they're exactly what you say. prepared to take innovation both at a regulatory level, but also at a utility level, and therefore, they can try things, and some of it's worked, some of it haven't, but it's a good test case in terms of other markets. So I think, I mean, if sort of, in terms of where we're, within Sign, we're very much focused on, I guess we see this digital transformation. We see a number of the areas that we're involved in, whether it's things like vegetation management, grid analytics, traditional GIS, things like virtual walkout. We see all these things coming together, and sort of, and I think that's again becomes quite an interesting trend of how some of these applications and some of these sort of user communities can start helping each other. I don't know whether you see the same thing happening.
Yeah, I think I think that's a big part of it. One of the issues we always hear people, I mean, whenever I talk about analytics or anything around data for utilities, I always get a bunch of hands up that say, where do we find all these data scientists? Where are we going? And my opinion is, if you're out looking for data scientists, you're taking the wrong approach. What you need to do is give your domain experts the tools to look like a data scientist. Yeah. And even then, we did a survey a while ago where we basically asked data scientists, how much time they do certain tasks. And if you put it into big buckets, they spend 80 to 90% of their time just collecting and cleaning data without really doing any analysis.
Yeah.
So the key takeaway to this just particular set of comments is get the tools to your domain experts.
Yeah.
Make them simple enough to use that they can use them effectively, and basically fix your data governance issues. Make sure they aren't spending all their time looking for the data, that they know where the important data is. And this is, again, we circle all the way back around to GIS as an accessible tool versus specialty. If weather and GIS and things like that are specialties, it makes it harder and harder for your domain experts to find the data they need to do the analysis.
Absolutely, and I think then also to make sure it's current, because again, to the point, and I think we were talking about this when we had the data maintenance piece, and yes, we need not only do you need accessibility data, but you need current data, and it has to be data that's fit for purpose. And I think it's sort of demystifying
confidence. People have to have confidence in that data. Absolutely. One of the problems you have with these big data projects is that they don't know where the data came from. They don't know how old it is. You might be making critical decisions on data that's 6 months old. So I think part of that data governance, and this is why, again, pulling GIS out of the specialty into a full data governance model is critical.
Yeah, and I think I absolutely agree, and I think that picks up to one of the questions that was on the feed about what are some of the mistakes. I think that's one of the big mistakes is go big bang and think of it as a specialist project, and then the moment you think of it like that, you're setting yourself up for a more risky outcome, I think.
Yeah, you won't get the adoption. In the end, no matter what type of system you put in, if people aren't using it for what you put it in for, then you're just throwing your money away.
Just very quickly, because I know we only got a couple of minutes. In the sort of the current pandemic scenario, I mean, have you seen any major trends, any particular things you'd want to comment? I mean, beyond the sort of clearly the constraints of working from home, etc.
Yeah, so I'm of two minds about this, really, and I'll kind of bring it together at the end. And I think on one side, I'll give you an example. I work with a very large water utility who, when their business is shut down in the area, they lost 60% of their revenue. They just suddenly had there was no more demand for water in large swaths of the operation, and that is money that will never come back. And so eventually they're going to have to go forward with probably rate increases to support their asset base. So how does that tie to this? It does impact IT operations and technology OT operations. OT operations, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, and so there is some tentativeness about spending money. But the big difference is this has been a shock to a lot of utilities who realize they need to become much more digital. And so they're looking at all these systems and they're realizing the only way we're going to be digital is by, as we've talked about, developing accessible data capabilities. And I think GIS is right at the forefront of that. And I think weather is probably not that far behind. And so I think the pandemic in one way has made utilities more tentative in spending money, But on the other side of it, they also, a number of them see that as an opportunity to digitize themselves and be much more resilient than they were up to this point.
Yeah, I think that's a very positive. I think it's a great message to probably end the call on, because I guess we're coming up to the end of our 30 minutes. But so Kevin, thank you so much. We could carry on talking for a lot longer. Thank you for everybody who listened and contributing some of the questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all, but it's been really informative. I hope you found it useful, everybody. And thank you very much indeed, Kevin.
Yep. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. All the best.